Redditors who have found dead bodies, what's the story?
My wife and I arrived early at an accident that had happened only moments before on the highway. 2 other guys and I jumped from our cars to try and help a very old man who was seemingly trapped in his car. I remember thinking he must still be alive because his eyelids flickered rapidly, but also realized that there was not blood flowing from his open wounds. When the medics arrived, they just quickly glanced at him and assured me that he was definitely dead already and I would not need to bother anymore. The only things haunting me afterwards were the smell of burning coolant oozing from the car and his crystal blue eyes. As I found out later, he was a local farmer who came from his field, drove onto the highway from there and just turned into oncoming traffic. Also, as we left, we passed 2 to 3 other cars with injured people who I could have actually have helped if we had not stopped at the very first wreck we saw. This is about 25 years ago. Didn't think about it for a decade.
You stopped to help as soon as you could. No one can blame you for that. I would have done the same thing.
Unfortunately, I've done this twice. Both times while at work, and under similar circumstances. I used to work as a harbor master for a smallish private shipyard. Mostly pleasure vessels, with a few being live aboards, but a few small commercial fishing vessels as well. Biggest ship there was an 80-footer. Each morning I would walk the docks to check moorings and look for anything that might need the attention of the maintenance department. The first was a floater I originally mistook for flotsam in the water after a holiday weekend. It was only after I had grabbed a boat hook and attempted to pull it out that I discovered what it was. I called our local Leos, who sent out a team, and set up barricades a bit up the pier to spare anyone else the discovery. It wasn't until after the remains were fished out that I was able to identify the body as one of the live aboards. After the coroner took possession, I escorted the Leos to his boat where we found a pretty large blood splat at the edge of his boarding plank. It was concluded that he had fallen when boarding, and hit his head, likely drowning while unconscious. The second was a suicide by gunshot. Another morning inspection gone horribly awry. I was walking the docks and saw what I thought was someone passed out on the deck. Not horribly uncommon. If you know any sailors, you know that there are some drinkers. So I walked over to wake him, get him below decks before the sun got too high. I couldn't see the mess spread behind him until I walked out onto the finger pier of his slip. I called my locals, put up barricades, the Leos sent their team out, collected the remains. I had to Google and call a cleanup team. Once the cleanup team was on site, a couple hours later, I left instructions with the maintenance team to pull the barricades when they were done, and went home. It was a pretty grisly scene, and it was a few days before I went back to work after that one. I took a new job about a month later.
I had my friend's neighbor die in my arms. He was about 55 and not in good health. I was sitting on the front step of my friend's house chatting to the neighbor as he worked on his car. Next thing, he stumbled towards me with a strange expression on his face and falls into my arms and dies. I actually saw the light go from his eyes. Tried CPR and rang an ambulance which arrived in minutes, but it turned out he'd had a massive heart attack.
That's rough. Hate it for your sake, but at the same time I'd be glad he didn't die alone.
Witnessed a bad car accident Christmas morning about 20 years ago. A van carrying a family crashed on 95 in Florida and apparently nobody was wearing seatbelts. Their bodies were all over the road, about 5 or 6 people.
That's horrible. I'm a huge stickler about people wearing seatbelts when I'm driving. They don't like it, but I don't care, and this is why.
I was 13 with dad in the car leaving home to a safer place during war. We saw about more than 9 people, including kids, dead covered with blood on the street. My dad stopped the car and told to not look. I wish I listened to him, and he put a something to cover them. Most likely it was a massacre. Edit. Thank you for all these supporting comments. Less than 3. It was in Syria back to 2013.
Jesus. I hope you and your family are in a safe place now.
I was an apartment manager for 20+ years. Received a call from a neighbor apartment that the girl next door was screaming, "My mum is dead." I ran up to the apartment with my maintenance techs and didn't even see all the blood on the walls and carpet. Got to the back bedroom and found my resident, a 43-year-old nurse, dead with her throat slit and had been stabbed 40 times. Her 16-year-old daughter had found her when she returned home from school. The victim's ex-boyfriend had found her and her daughter in our city, after they had escaped his terror from 2 states away, and murdered her. He ended up getting life in prison. I had to testify at the trial. This guy was such a freak that he tried to attack the bailiff and the judge during his trial.
The thought of meeting the wrong person just once and you're set for a life of fear is just so frightening to me.
Walked out to my girlfriend's living room and her 81-year-old grandpa was slumped over. By the look on his face I knew he was dead. 911 dispatch still wanted me to try chest compressions even though he had rigor mortis. The sound he made when his body hit the ground after being pulled out of his chair will stay with me until I die.
911 dispatcher here. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I can say for liability reasons we're supposed to encourage CPR no matter what. Each state's medical director can set standards of obvious death, where you aren't required, but my state has no such precedent. However, one time I took a call from a father who found his adult son dead. He had overdosed some time in the last 24 hours, but from what he was describing both rigor and livor mortis had set in. I made a split-second decision and told the father to close the bedroom door and go downstairs. If going by policy, I was 1000% in the wrong. I should have encouraged him to try CPR. However, I'd take a slap on the wrist at work over knowingly traumatizing a father when I know his son is dead. Also, if a dispatcher encourages you to do CPR, and you feel the person is 100% dead, you can tell them that and refuse CPR. You won't be in any trouble, and the dispatcher won't think less of you. Of course, this is only if you are 100% sure the person is dead.
I came home from work to find my fiancé dead on the living room floor. 911 wanted me to do chest compressions even though he was cold. I wasn't strong enough to roll him over, which ended up being a blessing. He'd been there long enough that his blood had settled to the lowest points in his body. Apparently his face was pretty gruesome. Glad that's not the last memory I have of his face.
I'm so sorry. I hope you are okay, pleading face.
Taking it one day at a time. Although it's been 3 years this year, I still miss him a lot.
Not me but my cousin. She was driving to work one morning when she noticed a light in front of a house that hadn't been there before. But there was something wrong with it. It didn't look like a normal light, it was shining up. She pulled over and looked closer, and could make out the shape of an SUV that had hit a tree and ended up with the nose up the trunk of the tree and front tires off the ground. It had been there so long that there was a covering of snow on it which was sort of filtering the headlights. That was the weird light she saw. She went over and brushed snow off the driver's window, and the driver was dead in his seat. I don't think he died in the crash. I think he crashed because he had died while driving, but I'm not sure. She didn't mention any blood, she only said how blue he was.
One of my great-uncles died while driving and rear-ended a semi. He had a stroke while in his 60s. My so and I lived in a 2-unit apartment building a couple years ago, in the upstairs unit. Downstairs was a middle-aged woman and her late teens or early 20s son. She worked overnights as a nurse, and I think he was doing college part-time or something, not exactly sure. One morning, I'm getting out of the shower, getting ready for work, and I hear the woman downstairs screaming my SO's name, crying for help. My so sleeps like the dead, so they had no idea, but I threw some shorts on and ran downstairs. The neighbor's son was face down in the middle of their hallway. I helped her flip him over so she could try mouth-to-mouth, but he was cold to the touch. I remember being startled by how heavily his head hit the ground when we flipped him. I called 911 while she did chest compressions and sobbed, but it was all way too late. Apparently he'd had an asthma attack and collapsed in the middle of the night. He'd been dead for hours by the time his mother got home from work and found him. Edit, spelling.
Jesus, the guilt would be awful for that poor woman. Even though it's obviously not her fault at all.
She ended up dying almost exactly a year later. She had some sort of a heart condition before all of this, and after her son died I believe she stopped taking care of herself so much. She suffered a fatal heart attack in her parked car.
This was 15 years ago or so, sitting in the parking lot of a Chuck E. Cheese in Bradenton, FL, waiting for my husband at the time to get out of Publix with Band-Aids for the blisters my shoes made. 6-year-old nephew in the back seat waiting to go into Chuck E. Cheese. A man gets out of his truck to meet a woman. Baby and toddler looked like a custody trade-off. The kids were put in his truck, they hugged, then he pulled a huge butcher knife out and stabbed her at least 10 times. Right in front of my car. I yelled at my 6-year-old nephew to get down, close his eyes and stay down. The man then got gasoline from the back of his pickup, poured it on himself and lit a lighter. This was now next to my window. He looked at me while he was lighting himself. I then jumped out, opened the back door and told my nephew to run as fast as he could into Chuck E. Cheese and get an adult. That man walked on fire what seemed like an eternity. He died, the woman lived. I'll never ever forget his skin that was left on the concrete.
Link.
My brother was a teenager when he found our dad. He was working outside in the heat and had a massive heart attack. The saddest thing in my life at that point, other than my dad dying, was my barely a teenager brother telling me he had closed our dad's eyes.
My dad committed suicide when I was 15, and although I'm sure it wasn't easy for my grandpa to see him, I'm sure everyone can agree we're so thankful my brother and I didn't see it.
Man, that's rough. I'm sorry you had to go through that. That's a whole nother level of heartbreak.
When I was 11, my best friend was run over by a garbage truck. I rounded the corner right after it happened and was the first to see his crushed head under the rear wheel. Edit. Thanks for the kind words, everybody. It was pretty surreal. I didn't know who it was at first. It took about 10 minutes for everyone to realize Joey was missing. And then it struck who was under the truck. The investigation said that the backup beeper on the truck wasn't working, so Joey never knew what was coming. They changed the rules where I live, and to this day there is always 2 people on the trucks now to make sure it doesn't happen again.
I was about 4 and I was playing in my sandbox. Then I walked further into the yard and found my uncle, who hung himself on our balcony. I thought he was trying to play hide and seek until he wouldn't move when I told him I found him and grabbed his foot.
That's so sad. I hope you're okay.
Thank you. Things have begun really looking up for me.
I was driving to the store to pick up beer for a hockey game get-together or something and saw a homeless guy riding his tricycle with a bunch of SFUFF on the front of it down a very busy highway-type road. He was riding against the traffic. On my way back there was one ambulance there, as he had just been hit by a vehicle and they were in the process of putting him in a body bag. I don't remember if the person who hit him stopped or not.
Poor guy just trying to ride his tricycle.
A girl that was missing for 3 days, last seen drunk in a club, turned up on one of the busiest beach bars midday during the summer. Turns out she decided to go night swimming. The club is by the sea as well, and drowned. It was a horrible sight to see. White as a sheet, her hair flowing in the water, face down, arms away, just swaying in the water, still wearing her evening party dress. Peaceful and yet very unnerving. Worst thing was I overheard 2 girls mocking the drowned girl, felt like I could hit them, but decided to bail with my wife. The morbid curiosity and the mob mentality can play tricks on your head.
Greater than worst thing was I overheard 2 girls mocking the drowned girl, felt like I could hit them. The people react in odd ways to death. I still remember being at work on 9/11 and one of my coworkers chuckling and saying, "Cool," as we watched the second plane hit. I have never wanted to punch someone so much in my life. AF-ing motorcycle at 180 km per hour embested into my primary school's door.
What exactly did you see?
Lots of blood, and a body with around 3/4 of its head.
When I was around 16 or 17, we had a neighbor that we were friendly with that housed 3 or 4 elderly folk in her house as a caretaker. One night while we were eating dinner, she ran in the front door yelling she needed help pulling a dead patient out from the gap between the bed and the wall. My father volunteered me and I hopped up thinking, how bad could it be, right? Well, I was not prepared for the noises and such that come from a fresh corpse, and it freaked my poo right out. When we got him pulled out and set up in a wheelchair, his head fell back and his mouth opened and his tongue stuck out. Freaked me out big time. I helped get him secure, then went home and called my dad an asshole and finished dinner.
Wow, your dad's an asshole. What kind of father volunteers their child to move a dead body and doesn't do it himself?
My first wife passed away in the bed next to me during the night due to an aneurysm. I reached over to touch her and she felt cold. It was almost shocking to feel good cold she felt. She wasn't moving like she would, and it took me a moment in my waking up to realize what was going on. Then the screaming and trying to do CPR, and the calling the police, and my children crying. That's about all I remember from that day. The screaming and crying.
Car crash. Truck had flipped over maybe 1 minute prior to our arrival. It had landed perfectly on top and squished the guy. His arm was still hanging out of the truck, so I checked to see if he had a pulse, but no such luck. Still warm, but blood and diesel fuel everywhere. We then saw kids' toys all over the road, so we did our best to look inside but saw no kids. I then crawled down the embankment into the woods looking for debris and possible ejected children. Police showed up 20 minutes later, pretty remote, and the coroner declared him dead. Poor guy looked like he over-corrected on a curve. Was only 23 and had 2 little kids he left behind. I don't think I'll ever get that image out of my head.
Went to my dad's apartment after a few days of no returned text messages or phone calls. Walked up and saw a stack of mail and newspapers by the door, and I instantly panicked. I was screaming, "Dad! Dad!" And with one shoulder thrust I broke the door in, hinges busted. I ran though the apt screaming his name, hoping he would be in bed sick and would respond. He didn't. I made it to the bathroom and found him dead, right in front of the tub. I touched him. It was clammy and cold. His face had melted into the rim of the tub. It was almost 10 years ago, but that image still haunts me. I'm just glad I found him and not my other family members.
I'm sorry you found him like that. I found my dad too. Like you, I was glad it was me that found him and not others in the family. I hope you are doing okay and taking care of yourself.
Thanks. You as well.
I was probably like 8 years old when I looked out the taxi window to see a dead guy who got squashed against a wall because of speeding. Edit, I was 6 years old, not 8.
We were stuck in bad traffic a few years ago. Turns out, right before we got there was a horrible accident on the bridge we were crossing. A guy was crumpled up laying on the ground not moving, in the other lane between some oddly positioned cars and a wrecked motorbike a few yards away. Turns out the biker got hit from behind by a driver who was not paying attention, flew off his bike and got hit mid-air by another car in the other lane. He died before he hit the ground. He wasn't wearing any protective gear either.
When I was 7, my uncle lived with me and my family. We didn't know he had a heroin problem until one day I went to get him for dinner and found him face down on the ground in his bedroom. That effed me up for a long time.
Found my uncle dead from a heroin OD as well. My grandma called my father and I to check on him because he hadn't come out of his room and she was scared to check. He was hunched over on the ground next to his bed with a needle still in his arm. One of his junkie friends was there too and took the needle. He left. My dad was screaming, crying and smacking him, trying to wake him up. Grandma quietly sobbing on her couch. Cops came and were very suspicious of his positioning and the fact that there was no needle. Worst day of my life.
I was working at a supermarket early one morning to get the loading dock ready for our big weekly delivery. Opened the dock door to find a car parked back there. It was a secluded area. Checked the car out, there was a naked couple in the back, still in an embrace hell, her legs were wrapped around him. They didn't look right, kinda pale, and no response, even from rocking the car. We called the police, they broke the window to confirm they were dead. It appeared that they had left the car running for the heater, but had backed it up against the wall blocking the exhaust pipe and died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Turns out they were married, just not to each other. It was a small community and word spread like wildfire. When the guy's wife showed up, she said, "He's lucky he's dead, otherwise I'd kill him."
Related story. I'm a photographer and I often stop my car to take pictures. One day I'm in a rural area, park my car and wander off quite a ways to take some shots. I look back and see a state trooper is slowly walking up to my car, but I can tell he's on point and very tense. I whistle and wave my arms, showing my camera. He visibly calms down and waits for me. I tell him that I just pulled over to do some shooting, picture taking, and he tells me he's relieved he had recently found a suicide in a car parked in a remote area, so thought my car would have the same.
Last day of school when I was 13 or 14. Went to the local park and was running around with some friends when one of us ran up and said he'd found a body. We thought he was bullpooting until he showed us. A guy had hung himself in a tree above a path, quite high up, so it must have taken some effort and he must have been there since early morning. I remember it smelled very similar to how war museums smell.
How did it smell like a war museum? I mean, I could get like a musty scent, but I'm not sure what you mean.
Coast Guard for over 20 years, lots of bodies but even more that we never found.
I hear it's like a weekly thing for Coast Guard stationed at the Golden Gate Bridge since so many jump there.
I was just walking home from a friend's house when I lived in Boston, probably around 98 feet, and a kid was swinging from his front porch.
Not me but my husband. He worked for a time as a reporter at a small local newspaper in the Southern California mountains. He was told to write an article about a guy who had gone camping but didn't come home when expected. The guy was still missing after a few days. My husband went out hiking in the area where the guy was last seen, trying to get some context for the story, and stumbled on the guy's campsite, and his dead body. He'd died of natural causes. My husband never gave me details except to say that the smell was horrible.
I was working night shift as a caregiver. Someone called me and said their wife might be dead. I go up and she is just sitting on the couch. Pale and cool to the touch. No pulse. I call 911 and call the family. Super awesome family. I loved them all. The whole family showed up to console their father. We all chatted and shared memories. 911 came, did their thing. I did my report. An overall pleasant experience for something a little morbid.
I wouldn't even call that morbid. It sounds like a relatively pleasant death, and it wasn't unexpected.
I think it's this preconceived notion that death is naturally supposed to be spooky and creepy. I'm sure there are certain cases. From my own personal experiences and experiences as a caregiver, it hasn't been. I think I just assume people will react negatively. Thank you for the comment.
Found my cousin floating upside down in the bathtub. They said she slipped and knocked herself out. To this day I never fill the bathtub more than 1/4 full. Edit. Guys, I didn't just leave her to die. I started screaming and my mom came and we called the ambulance. She was alive when the ambulance showed up, but was pronounced dead by the time they got to the hospital. Rip Nokuthula, I miss you every day.
Was doing an industrial year working abroad. We formed a little community from across the different universities. My girlfriend came and told me a guy's door was open when he was meant to have flown home that morning, so I go check it out. I see a body curled up in the fetal position with a pool of blood. One touch of his skin confirmed he was gone. Onions time. It was Christmas Eve. His phone had a ton of missed calls from his mother.
I work in a hotel, and unfortunately it comes with the territory.
Years ago I worked with a guy who was a manager at a major chain hotel, Courtyard maybe, and left to go into sales. Since it was such a random change, I asked him why he left, and he explained for over an hour about all the suicides he dealt with, as he was usually the one that found the bodies. Apparently hotels are very popular for suicides, as they usually don't want family to discover their dead body, so they rent a hotel room for several days, to make sure they succeed and aren't found and revived, and do it in private. He even said in the end he was pretty good at spotting the sign of a suicidal person, since they'd usually book a room for a few days but not have any luggage. Most of the time it was a overdose or a lethal ingestion of sleeping pills, but the one that caused him to quit was a cutter. He came to the room to investigate after they hung that "Do Not Disturb" sign up for several days and found this woman's body laying in the bathtub with blood all over the bathroom. Apparently it was so traumatic he quit later that week and never wanted to go back into hotel management again.
I'm a hotel GM for a similar chain of hotels, and yes, overdoses for suicide are common. I've been doing this for 10+ years now. It doesn't matter how it's done. Finding a body is not a pleasant experience.
I was on my way to a haircut early in the morning and saw a homeless woman sleeping in the doorway of a business. I set a care package next to here and got my hair done. 2 hours later I walked past her on my way back to my car and she hadn't moved an inch. I tried talking to her but she didn't move. When I got closer I could tell she wasn't breathing and her face did not look like she was sleeping. I called 911 and they said they'd send somebody over. It took almost an hour before a walking cop stopped by and actually checked her.
I was skipping school with my buddies, and we went hiking at a nearby state park. There was a good-size rock outcropping that we were about to climb when a couple of us found a body that looked stuffed into a space between a couple boulders. He was very obviously dead. Some other hikers who were nearby heard our commotion and came over. They were on their way down and agreed to call the cops. We proceeded to climb the rocks and get high as originally planned.
At least you have your priorities sought out.
Pulled up anchor in boat after fishing on giant river. Felt like was pulling up a tree trunk. Got anchor to top and a decomposing body was attached. Freaked out, let go of anchor. Pulled it up again and body was gone.
Did you ever stop screaming? I don't think I would. Thank you for watching. We upload new videos every day, so be sure to come back for more fun. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video.